We're going to begin. I know that people still may be trying to get in, but we're going to try to begin. I'm Alan Hausman. I'm the Executive Director of CLASP, and I'm welcoming you to, can't hear?
Dave?
Okay. Is that better? Okay. I'm Alan Hausman. I'm the Executive Director of CLASP, and I want to welcome you to our 40th anniversary policy series called Policy and Promise for Low-Income People in America. I hope you are all aware that CLASP develops and advocates for policies to improve the lives of low-income people. We advocate at the federal, state, and local level. And we essentially focus on three broad areas of work: strengthening children, youth, and families, creating pathways to education and work, and increasing opportunity, equal justice, and racial equity. So this program here today, which is the sixth of our series and the last of our series, the Promise and Challenge of Evidence-Based Policy, this program looks at all three of our areas of work in some sense, because all three of our areas, we try to ground it in evidence-based policy. The other 5 sessions that we've had included a number of different aspects of work we do. We had a wonderful time with Wes Moore, who some of you may know. We highlighted the 2025 campaign for black men and boys. We had a session on racial equity and federal policy. We had another session on exploring the changing demographics of children, and another session on developing America's workforce, learning 40 years of policy and practice to inform the next generation. So our policy series has encompassed looking at a number of aspects of work we do here and a number of challenges that we all face as we go into the new environment we may be facing in the future. And now I'd like to turn the podium over to Rutledge Hudson and to let her carry on today's session, The Promise and Challenge of Evidence-Based Policy. And I'd like to welcome as well 2 very close friends of CLASP, Gordon Berlin and Lee Shore. Rutledge?
I'm actually going to speak from here. Can you guys hear me in the back? Okay, great. What I want to do first is give very brief introductions of Gordon and Lee. I suspect most of you know them. We just had lunch and we were talking about that I shouldn't go belabor this, but I think it's important for you to know the breadth of their experience, so I'm going to try to do that. They have both spent their careers trying to improve the lives of vulnerable or disadvantaged individuals and families, and building an evidence to inform those efforts. I'll start with Lee, who's on my right. She is a senior fellow at the Center for the Study of Social Policy. She's also a lecturer in social medicine at Harvard. She is on the executive committee of the Aspen Institute's Roundtable on Community Change. She is a member of the Institute of Medicine, and she's written many books and articles, and if you want more details, go look at her bio on our webpage. Gordon, who is on my left, is president of MDRC, which, as many of you know, develops and evaluates a variety of promising approaches in education and social innovations. Prior to that, he was, or I may not have this in the right order, but in any event, he has also served as the Executive Deputy Administrator for Management, Budget, and Policy, that's a mouthful, in New York City for the Department of Human Resources. He was director of the Ford Foundation's Urban Poverty Program, and he worked at the Department of Labor in the Education and Training Administration. So you can see that they bring a wealth of knowledge, and I am incredibly honored that they would join us here today and share our knowledge, share their knowledge with us. I'm going to do quick housekeeping things, so please bear with me for just a moment. First, when you sat down, you had 4 handouts on your chair. These will perhaps be referred to during the course of the event, so I'm just going to tell you what they are. The first one is a very rough graphic that we here at class put together to give an idea of the kinds of decisions that policymakers and practitioners have to make. The second one is, again, a very quick graphic of the kinds of evidence that could be used, from theoretical knowledge to program evaluations to synthesis. The third one is Lee's much more sophisticated chart of how you might use evidence to influence policymaking in practice. And last, you have a brochure from MDRC that talks about all the wonderful work they're trying to do in the intersection of policymaking and practice. So that's what you've got in front of you. Second, you have sign-in sheets that are going around. The reason for the sign-in sheets is that as we have been talking over the last few weeks and putting this together, we realized that we could keep you here for 7 days and that you would still have more to learn from them. And I didn't think I could keep you here for 7 days. So I envision this as the beginning of an ongoing dialogue. I'm not quite sure what form it will take, but we want your contact information so that we can engage you to the extent you want to be engaged in all of those ways. The next thing I want to tell you is who's here, or who I think is here, since I haven't seen the sign-in sheets yet. In terms of registration, we have had registration from all kinds of departments within the administration, Department of Labor, Department of Education, HHS, and within each of those agencies, both programmatic staff and research staff, which I think is exciting. We have a number of folks from the Office of Management and Budget here. From the Hill, we have both Hill staff and GAO staff. In addition, we have foundations, individual foundations, and funding affinity groups. We have a number of members of the press here. And then, of course, we have many of the colleague organizations that CLASP works with across the broad range of areas that Alan mentioned. I wanted to take the time in our very full schedule to tell you that because it speaks to how much interest there is in this topic and how it applies to everything that we all do. So that's really exciting. Real logistics, restrooms, if you should need them, are in the elevator lobby. They are not locked. For those of you who need to use the women's room, you sometimes have to put your shoulder into the door because of the way they painted it, but it's not locked, I promise. Second, please turn off your cell phones if you have not already, because we have a lot of information to cover. And finally, at the end of today's forum, we hope that you will join us in the lobby to continue the discussion. We have some cookies and soft drinks. I didn't want to put them out before you came in because I wasn't sure I could get you in here and get us started in time if I put them out ahead of time. All right, so that's the logistics and housekeeping things. Let me tell you a little bit about the framework that I see for this forum. Why is evidence-based policy and practice such a hot issue now? It comes from a lot of different places. The philanthropic community has been thinking about how do we invest our dollars most effectively. I think at the government level, from local to federal, everybody's been saying, how do we get the biggest bang for our buck, particularly in these economic times? And how do we stretch the dollars the furthest? And how do we make sure that the things we're doing all line up and fit together? I think all of those things have been percolating for a number of years. And I think the current administration, the Obama administration, has kind of crystallized this focus by calling upon each of its agencies to really think about evidence in their policymaking and their practice. So I think that's sort of how we got to where we are. Now, one reason you could say this is a hot topic is that it's controversial. Well, I would like to put forward a premise that CLASP believes, and that is evidence-based policy and practice is not controversial. We all think evidence should inform policy and practice. The controversy, the disagreement comes in the implementation and the never mind. Thank you. Of what evidence-based policy and practice means. And that's going to be the core of what we talk about today and really try to get into today. What we're going to do is that I'm going to go through and ask some questions to Lee and Gordon. They're really going to engage in a dialogue, and I'm going to try to stay out of the way, occasionally ask a clarifying question. And then at the end, we will open it up to questions from the audience. Okay? So to start, Gordon and Lee, I think it would be helpful if each of you could offer a little bit of background on your organization and your personal mindset about the promise and challenge of evidence-based policy, what framework you use to think about the intersection between evidence building and policy making and guiding practice, and what role your organization plays in that intersection. That was one question, just in case anyone's keeping track. So, chivalry.
Hi, I'm really delighted we're having this conversation because I think it's a very important one. I'm a senior fellow, as Rutledge told you, at the Center for the Study of Social Policy, and which is a policy research and technical assistance organization based here in Washington. Many of you know it. The work we do is quite similar to the work of CLASP, as Alan described it. It's directed at improving outcomes for disadvantaged kids and families. We focus a lot on public policy and public systems. We've also, in the last decade or so, been working directly at the community level, supporting neighborhood people who are trying to improve outcomes for vulnerable kids and families. My personal background is that since I don't have an academic specialty, and people say, well, what exactly do you specialize in? Since I tell them it's not education, it's not health, it's not child welfare, it's not juvenile justice, it's all of those. But I've decided that I specialize in what works. I wrote a book in the 1980s about programs that were in fact improving outcomes for disadvantaged kids, called Within Our Reach. When I found 5 years later that those programs were dismembered or diluted or destroyed, only very few of them were being built on, I asked, why is that? And that's how I got interested in systems and the context in which programs have to exist in order to thrive. And I wrote another book about that called Common Purpose. I spent the early 2000s compiling what we knew about that communities could act on to achieve certain outcomes. I called it pathways to outcomes, and the outcomes we used were school readiness, third grade school success, reduction of child abuse and neglect, and successful transition to young adulthood. During the Obama campaign, as you all know, Senator Obama sort of fell in love with the Harlem Children's Zone and said he wanted those all over the country, and he did pledge that there would be at least 20 if he got elected. And I got quite fascinated by that idea about how do you replicate something as complicated and as many faceted as the Harlem Children's Zone, and wrote a paper under CSSP auspices even before the election about the challenges of doing that. And soon after the election, there was a seminar at Brookings about the impending Promise Neighborhoods, and each one of the panelists said, and of course these have to be very, very carefully evaluated. And in the question period, somebody said, so how are you going to do that? And the answer was quite blithely rendered by one of the panelists and said, well, we'll just evaluate each one of the component programs and see if it's working. And it didn't seem to bother anybody in the audience that of course missed the whole point of doing a comprehensive place-based program like that it would leverage the connections and the infrastructure and so on. So we got interested in that and how you would do that, and then pretty soon we got involved with the Social Innovation Fund and I3 in the Department of Education, and found that this issue of how you're going to evaluate these complex programs was a big one. And we concluded that the evidence-based discussion had become too narrow, that we thought you had to be committed to evidence-based, to policy that and practice that would be evidence-based, but that you had to define evidence much more broadly than it was currently being defined. And that's sort of the perspective I have on this discussion.
That's great. Gordon?
Well, thanks. I want to start by just saying what an honor it is to be here and to be part of the 40th anniversary series that CLASP is putting on. I've been a big admirer of the leadership and changes that Alan has brought at CLASP over the years, and it's just really a pleasure to be here with all of you. I'm going to take a moment or two to talk about MDRC, and I think it sets up an interesting contrast in terms of, it's sort of where you sit is often where you stand. And at MDRC, I would say we're more focused on programs and how effective programs are. And it's interesting to think about us looking up through programs to systems, and Lee looking down at programs through her vantage point sitting at systems. And maybe that will be helpful as we think about some of the issues. So MDRC is what's called a research and demonstration intermediary organization. And our mission is to advance the well-being of low-income families, children, and adults by improving the policies and programs that affect them. And we try to do that essentially in three ways. You might think of them as kind of three core goals or competencies that the organization has. The first is that we want to build a reliable body of evidence about what works and also what doesn't work. Secondly, we want to build the capacity and the infrastructure to operate high-quality programs. And third, because these are large numbers problems, we want to leverage public and private funding so that these programs can both expand and be maintained at some scale. And we think of ourselves as doing all of these things together. Now, we pursue these three objectives in the following ways. Let me describe 3 or 4 distinguishing characteristics of MDRC. The first one, there are a lot of organizations in this space, and I would say one of the important distinctions of MDRC is that we're focused on solutions. A lot of organizations spend a lot of time studying the problem and think that's enough to understand what would work and what would really make a difference. But our experience has been that the first time that we try something or evaluate something, it often doesn't work, or it only works a little. And the challenge really is to stay with it and to think about what it's going to take to build a reliable body of evidence, essentially one study building on the next. So we don't think about the work we do as being an up or down. Oh, we did a study, it worked. We're going to do more of it. We did a study, it didn't work. We're going to do none of it. We view each of these things as a kind of process that is going to help us really improve the effectiveness of programs, and I think that's really an important distinction. The second thing is that MDRC, in order to accomplish these goals, has to have a strong technical assistance and capacity building expertise, because we study both existing programs and we're responsible for developing and designing new program ideas. And we want the things that we develop and the things that we study to be as strong as they can be. We don't want to measure ineffectual startup, because then you get to the end and you don't know whether the particular model you've designed is effective. All you know is that it wasn't put in the field very well. So as an intermediary organization, we spend a lot of time worrying about that stuff. About a third of the people at MDRC have no research background at all, which I'm sure, given our reputation, shocks all of you. The third hallmark of MDRC is our our research capacity. And there, we're trying to answer 3 questions in all the work that we do. The first question that we want to answer is the what difference question. Is this program really effective? What difference is it making? Is it making a difference above and beyond what would have happened anyway for the people who participate in it? Secondly, though, we also want to know how it achieved the results that it achieved and why it achieved the results that it achieved. And these how and why questions, which involve more qualitative methods as opposed to the quantitative methods for answering the what difference question, are crucial for understanding what you're going to do next if I'm right and this program only is going to have small effects or no effects initially. We're using the how and why to really generate information about what we ought to try next. In addition, if it does work really well and you get quantum leaps and it's the kind of thing that you want to do at scale and in other places, the how and why is going to tell us a lot more about what was essential there. And I guess the final thing I would say about these core sort of competencies that we try to foster at the organization, everything we do, we want to do in partnership and with organizations on the ground and in the field, as well as policymakers and philanthropy and funders. And we also want to make sure that we're doing a good job communicating what we're learning. We want you all, all of the key stakeholders, to know everything that we know, so that we can work together in figuring out what the next test or strategy really ought to be. So now let me just list a couple of, well, it's more than a couple, 4 or 5 sort of tenets or principles that have emerged from our work over time that we try to stay true to. The first one I've already mentioned, and that's that evidence building shouldn't be a one-time thumbs up or thumbs down kind of activity. It should be an integral part of a program improvement strategy. Every study that we do, we learn something that surprised us and surprised the program people who are running that. So we think about evidence building as a process with each study and each initiative building on the next. The second thing that we found is that it's really, really important to be clear about the question you want to answer. And there's just a lot of confusion about this, we find, when we're working with and talking to people in the field. Different research methods answer different questions. And I often find that people will take a question or a method that's good for one question and use it to try to answer another question. And so we spend a lot of time trying to be really clear about what question do we really have the answer to, what method is right to answer that question. A third thing that we've discovered is, or that we want people to understand, is that there's a real difference between evaluation data and program data. So the former, evaluation data, is often done by an external party where we're trying to understand how your program is operating. And it has an interesting characteristic, and that characteristic is that it's for the most part backward looking, right? We're following a group of people at a particular point in time, reaching an endpoint in which we issue a report and say this program had these effects and here's how and why we think they had these effects. Program data is more forward looking. It's the data you're using on an ongoing everyday basis to try to manage your program, to think about what changes are needed, et cetera. And you want to think about how you use both of those kinds of data. And I would say at the outset, there's a very difficult problem of linking these two things. The simple framework for talking about it is the difference between often outcomes and impacts. And the research community has profoundly failed program managers when it comes to tying impacts to the performance indicator kind of measures they need to go forward. OMB has struggled with that problem in its PART system, for example, now that it's trying to push more rigorous evidence evaluation building kinds of information. Another point that we have learned over time is that not every program is ready for an impact study. And we've found that the discipline of assessing whether or not a given program or policy is ready, what we kind of call at MDRC ready for evaluation, is an incredibly useful process for program improvement. We find that when we sit with a program, we often get approached by people, everybody wants evidence, we want you to do an impact study. And we'll often find that the program isn't well defined adequately. in this process, or that people aren't flowing through and getting the dosage, and engagement just really isn't there, or the quality doesn't look good, or there's huge variation from program to program to program, or the sample size isn't big enough, or a range of other reasons why this program doesn't feel like, to us, it's ready. And we often say no about doing an impact study, but might recommend a range of other studies. And I am getting to the end here. The last two things I want to say is I really believe that we're at a kind of break point in this area now, because we're beginning to understand better, with more reliability, things that work. And the next challenge or frontier is doing those things at real scale and maintaining the quality that we found in those initial studies. So I want to conclude by just saying, a lot of people approach me and they'll say, well, we're thinking about doing a study, but what really drives impacts? How can I be sure I'm going to get to the end and actually have results, that will be helpful to me, et cetera? Putting aside, unfortunately, most people think it's only helpful if the results are that it works great, right? Which I think is the wrong way to think about these things. But there are essentially 4 things that determine whether we would find, when we were doing an impact study, that a program was effective. The first one is, what are you doing? What's the model? Is it really fit well with the program? With the problem you're trying to solve? Is it a set of components, and are you delivering something that's really meaningful there? So the first thing is the what. The second thing is, how well do you do it? What's the quality of this initiative? How well is it implemented over time? The third, and equally important, is who you serve. Are you serving a group of people that really can benefit from this program, or would they have likely been able to get where you can get them on their own anyway? And there are lots of reasons to think that could be happening. Programs are under tremendous pressure from performance-based standards, for example. If you're in the WIA system, you're not in a performance-based structure they have, you're not going to get paid if you don't get the person a GED or you don't get them a job. So I'm under tremendous pressure to pick people who have 9th grade reading levels and a long work history in order to achieve those kinds of goals. If I do a net impact study, chances are I'm not going to find that you're making a very big difference. And last, the context in which you operate, and what are the alternatives that are available to people in the field. So I look forward to a more give and take discussion as we go forward.
Okay, so let me turn to something that I think both Gordon and Lee talked about that was really important, and that is there are different questions that policymakers and practitioners have to answer. Dave, have we lost our mic? Okay. Thank you for that in the back. It's hard to know from up here what can carry. I want to pick up on something I think both Gordon and Lee talked about that's really important, and that is that there are a series of questions that a policymaker and a practitioner have got to make a decision about, and there are different types of evidence and different methodologies that inform that. And what I'd like to do is ask each of you to take one example and no more than 5 minutes and try to explain, if you were answering this particular question, what evidence would you advise the policymaker or practitioner to look at? Lee, do you want to start with that since we just heard from Gordon?
Are we going to pick one of these now and others later, or
Yes.
are we going to do several?
Well,
I have to know whether I need to go to my favorite one first.
No, don't go to your favorite one first. We're coming to that one later.
Okay. Well, since one of my points is, my sort of overarching point is about how we should think of evidence from many different sources, that is the point of this blue chart, that evidence comes from program evaluations, from other research, from theory, from practice, and it's actually quite similar to the chart with the circles that CLASP did. One difference being that this shows that all of these go through a synthesis in order to get you to the kind of evidence base that will be useful in improving outcomes. You have to synthesize from within each of these boxes, but you also have to synthesize across them in order to get the most usable kinds of information. So one example would be the identifying high priority problems and what contributes to them. Well, think about a few problems that people are really worried about where we don't have a program to match. For example, social isolation. There's an enormous amount of research and theory about the huge risk factor that social isolation represents. And yet, we have very few programs that have anything really reliable to show that we know how to fix that. We have programs that begin to get at it a little bit. I think a lot of the family support centers try to get at that. Some of the home visiting tries to get at that. But we don't have anything solid. So we need the research on the problems to give us, to define that for us. In child welfare, we have too many kids in congregate care. We have kids in too many different placements. We don't have a program that has been shown to fix that. So another one is, I don't know how many of you have sort of tuned into the Harvard Center on the Developing Child, but they're coming out with an enormous amount of research that starts with brain development in the very early years, showing that significant adversity in the very early years is a huge risk factor for lifelong health problems, social problems, etc. Well, that would lead you to do things a little differently from what we're doing. It would not only lead you to Early Head Start, it would lead you to pay attention to the kids who are in family, friend, and neighbor care. 41% of low-income children under age 5 with employed mothers are in family, friend, and neighbor care. We don't have the instruments. We don't have the institutional instruments or the programs to get at that. So you need to look at the research to find what are the problems that we haven't yet successfully addressed that we should be looking at.
Very helpful. Thank you. Gordon?
So as I was thinking about this question and looking at the two frameworks that Lee and Rutledge put on your chairs, it occurred to me that it's helpful to think about the separately program and the framework for program and the framework for evidence. So if you start with program, you might think about 3 or 4 stages that you would go through. The first is kind of the example that Lee used, which is model building. It's stage 1, where you're trying to use a range of information to understand the problem really well, and with that problem information securely in hand, beginning to think about where you would intervene, what's the right point of intervention, how much you would rely on current things, how much you need to create something new, where's the right angle or policy area, right angle to intervene at, with what set of services, and you'd run a pilot program and try to understand the operational feasibility and begin to think about where it fits in other systems. A second stage would be what I would kind of call ongoing operating program. This program is proven out pretty well. Now you're beginning to manualize it, create a set of protocols. You're thinking a lot more about talent, managing the day-to-day operation, recruiting people, thinking about a secure and stable funding base. And once a program is operating at that level, There are a range of things that you need to understand, like you could be bridge spanned, for example, and have an organizational assessment done of your organization. You might be tweaking your management information system to understand a lot more how people flow through, what kind of intensity of services they get, how engaged are they really, are you holding on to people? You'd be examining your recruitment system, and you'd be using outcome information to try to understand where people are going after they leave your program, whether they're leaving having achieved your goals. The next, third stage would be scaling and replication. Think about Dorothy Stoneman running the Youth Action Program in East Harlem and then taking that to Youth Build and it becoming a national program. There are a whole set of very different issues that one needs to think about, and different kinds of evidence and information and management structures that people need to do under that kind of a structure. If the classic example is if you try to run the expansion and run the program that you originally started. Dorothy was wise. She left the Youth Action Program in East Harlem. She moved to Boston, or the Somerville, Mass, I guess, and then began putting together a strategy to take the program national, and had really stepped away from having to deal with a lot of the day-to-day kind of stuff. And then the final stage that might or might flow here is this question of system building. So once you have a set of initiatives that are looking pretty promising, or sometimes not so promising, you're worrying a lot about how to build connections across those things. And the classic one is for very vulnerable youth around child welfare and juvenile justice and special education, and how people end up with lots of overlapping services and caseworkers and demands, and yet still fall through the cracks, et cetera. So now put on a hat that's a little bit more about the kinds of information that you need, and implementation research is needed at various stages, as I've described, organizational assessments, longitudinal data that helps me find out what happened to my people over time. Maybe I have a great placement rate, but I find out that almost everyone in my group that I served 2 years out isn't working at all. I don't need anything more than that to know that I've got a problem, and I need to really work on that. And then when it comes to deciding impact studies, there are essentially two kinds that you would be thinking about. An efficacy study, in which you're really trying to understand proof of concept, usually at that early stage when a program is first designed and has been operating for a while. It's stable enough. It makes sense to try to do a small-scale study, maybe a somewhat rigorous study with a counterfactual, to try to be sure you've got your arms around how this thing is working. And it's meant to be, efficacy studies are meant to be just that, proof of concept. For a more operational program, you'd be thinking about an effectiveness study, like the Head Start evaluation or a Job Corps evaluation, where you're looking at the average effect, but if you're wise, and this is an area where I think we haven't done a good enough job, you would want to also try to think about designing the study so that you can exploit variation. Why is it that some Job Corps programs seem to do a lot better than others? Is there something about the characteristics of those programs? And that's this issue that I've been talking about, where I think we're on the frontier of scaling. We could begin to learn a lot more if we thought more creatively and thoughtfully about the range of things we need to collect data on to begin to understand that. For example, a common factor in programs that seem to be successful might be personalization. We've seen it in school settings in some of the research that we've done. It came up in our welfare to work studies originally.
Yeah, I just would like to add something to what Gordon has just said about that we're getting the kind of data that allows us to generalize much more than we did before. And if you have data about programs that are trying to achieve the same result, then you can actually extract the common factors. And I think that is a very, very promising thing for the future. It hasn't been done a lot in the past. There was a wonderful example of a group at Georgetown, the Georgetown Center for Juvenile Justice Reform, that looked at 500 and some interventions that were trying to reduce recidivism among juveniles. And they were able to find, that personalization was one of the common factors across the most successful programs. Child Trends is trying to do that, to try to discover the common patterns among things that worked. And I mentioned at lunch that just today there was in the MDRC emails was one doing exactly that with improving outcomes of developmental education, which some of us who are very old think of as remedial education.
In community colleges.
In community colleges after high school, right. And all, to find those common factors requires a kind of funding and a kind of expertise and a kind of institutional development that we haven't seen enough of, I think.
So I'm going to take a prerogative here to summarize where I think we are at this point, what we have heard. I think, a short way of saying it is evidence is absolutely necessary to good policy making and practice, but it's not sufficient. We've got to figure out what the right kind of evidence is to answer the right kinds of questions. I think you've heard really good examples of different ways that different questions can be answered. What I want to turn to now are what I identified to Leah and Gordon as what I think are some of the harder questions that people are really wrestling with as we try to implement this notion of evidence-based policy making and practice. And I start with the assumption that what we're trying to do with the evidence is to answer two core questions. I mean, there's lots of questions, but two that I think we're most wrestling with now are how do we get the outcome, the impact in the person's life that we want, and how much does it cost us to get that impact? And those are sort of, with that sort of framing, I'm going to try to focus the remainder of our questions on, I think, some of the key struggles or issue areas where people are looking at this. And this point, I think what I'm going to do is just have you guys engage in a dialogue. I'll throw out the question and let you guys engage in a dialogue. My first question, this goes back to something you said earlier, Gordon, that I think is really critical. How do we, as policymakers or practitioners, look at whatever data is in front of us and really assess the impact on people's lives? And I'm going to turn to you first just because I've heard you do this. What's the difference between a statistically significant effect size and what happens in people's day-to-day lives?
Well, I always get thrown when the impact word gets used, and I want to launch into a discussion of random assignment, but I'm going to not do that. So
I promise we come to that in a minute.
So the obvious thing here is there's a real difference between statistical significance and all that's telling you, and policy significance. Statistical significance is just telling you whether or not the answer that you've gotten is reliable and whether you can believe it. And it's all really a function of sample size and what's called a power calculation. So if we were able to do studies in which we had enormously large samples, differences of 1 point or something would be statistically significant. But that doesn't mean that they're relevant in terms of policy. You have to look at the absolute levels, try to understand what the issue is, and make a decision about whether or not this investment really is getting people far enough, or whether you think, in fact, something different really needs to be done. And there's in every field, it depends a lot on what the issue is, what the need is, how hard it's been to move the needle in a given topic or category. I think it's a very fair question to get on the table because there have been instances in which certainly government agencies seem to have been overwhelmingly preoccupied with statistical significance and had no sense at all of policy significance. And in fact, there's been an effort afoot to try to discourage having discussion sections in which one might discuss the meaning of a statistically significant finding and thus put it in some context. Like, for example, this effect is equivalent to 1/3 of the black-white achievement gap. Oh, didn't seem that big to me, but now that I understand it in that context, I would pay a lot more attention to it. So that's what I would say about that.
It seems to me that we need to think not just about the difference between statistical significance and policy significance, but also significance for people, families, neighborhoods. And policy I see as a sort of an intermediate point there. And if you frame your work in terms of results for real life results for kids, families, neighborhoods, and you decide that you're not so interested in the really trivial stuff where it's easier to get statistical significance, and you want to really focus on the important stuff, then you begin to say, well, maybe it's more important to have a lot of reliable information than a little bit of certain information. And I think we have gone so far in our striving for certain information. There was a list of proven programs on the Child Trends website. And I don't want to distort this because that Child Trends website is wonderful. But it just happened that the first one on the list was the proven impact of training for preschool teachers in putting sunscreen on kids. And that had the very statistically reliable impact of their actually doing it. And you think about that, and then you think about how do we know about the impact of the Harlem Children's Zone? And not only do we not want to use the same methodology for those two, as you've pointed out, Gordon, but we really have to think quite differently. And that's why even on program evaluations, I have on my chart the 3 different kinds, the experimental ones, the multiple results-oriented, and the formative ones, because you get too little information, even though you get it for a certainty, about too few important things when you just rely on statistically significant results, which you can only get when the N is higher. And let me just tell you a very quick story. I was meeting with the head of an organization, which I'm going to try not to identify, whose major intervention is done by highly skilled professionals. They're at 6 sites, and they got a whole bunch of money for a very fancy evaluation. One of the 6 sites began to run out of money. And the only way they could stay afloat was to substitute volunteers for the highly trained professionals. And so the head of the organization, the umbrella organization, said, this makes us very sad and so on. And I said, well, at least you'll know what the difference is. And she said, we won't. And I said, what do you mean you won't? And she said, because our evaluator told us that the N is too small. Well, the N is too small to know for certain. But boy, you can learn a lot from how those kids fared. Did they get promoted from grade to grade? Did they get arrested? Were they in the emergency room? Were they in foster care? You can learn a lot by counting last year and this year. Now, that doesn't measure up to the standards that we need for certain information, but it sure is going to tell that organization something very, very important. So that's why I don't want to get stuck on what's statistically significant.
Okay, I think that's actually a good segue to a question that I think may take a little time for you guys to go back and forth on. Evaluations that use random assignment are considered by many to be the gold standard to answer certain types of questions, right? We've already clarified that there's certain things that certain types of evidence answer. So it would be helpful for me if you would both talk about which types of questions random assignment studies can answer, what alternatives there are to them when you don't have such evaluations. When are those alternatives appropriate? When are they not appropriate? How do you balance the cost of those kinds of evaluations? So again, that's one question. But it's meant to just sort of throw open that dialogue that I think you sort of started, Lee, and so I'll let Gordon go first, and then you guys can go back and forth.
Okay, great. So I'm going to wear the certainty hat and say that you need at least some of it at some point in the process if you're really going to know that you're on the right track or not. But I agree with Lee that a lot of information can be helpful, and certainly a lot of the information that Lee just described is process information that I certainly could use to understand how I might make some differences if I want to make sure that people are flowing through my system and getting more or less. But let me talk a little bit about why random assignment is considered by so many people to be the gold standard. It's not some conspiracy of pointy-headed academics in a university. It's actually a pretty straightforward set of challenges, really 3 challenges, that have come together to make random assignment an important tool for any evaluator to use. So the first 2 problems that you'd have to solve if you were going to evaluate a program are maturation and what I would label maybe history or the environment. So let's say that we want to know whether a program that serves young people is effective or not, maybe some of the very young kids that Lee just described, and you're worried about brain development or early childhood education, et cetera. So the first thing that you have to come to grips with is that their brains grow and develop, the hormones kick in and they don't, or they recede. They learn new things every single day, whether you do anything or not, whether your program is there or not, right? And the challenge really is trying to figure out how do we avoid taking credit for what would have happened anyway via the regular course of a young person's development. So that's the maturation problem. How are we going to figure that out? How are we going to sort out whether or not this child is reading better now because of something that we did or something that happened in the normal course of a school year for all the kids? The second problem might be under the label, or challenge, it might be under the label of history or environment. So let's say we're studying a job placement program. And there the question is, how much of what happens over time is due to a downturn in the economy or to an upturn in the economy? Think about right now. I'm studying a job placement program. Their placement rates are really down over the last several years. Have they failed? Have things really gotten worse? It may very well be that they made people better off than they would have been otherwise. The unemployment rate for that group of people could have been dramatically higher, even though it was higher than they had seen in the past for that program. So the challenge then with both history and maturation is how to determine how much of what we're seeing is due to that versus how much of it is due to the program. And there's only really one way to solve that problem, and that is you need a counterfactual. Something to tell you, a comparison. What would have happened if this program didn't exist? And that's where the third challenge comes. And that is under the label of selection bias. Most of the programs we want to study are voluntary. And by definition, the people who volunteer are different than people who don't. They might look alike on everything that we could dream up. But fundamentally, their motivation, their information base they have is different. And then programs and policymakers often exacerbate that problem because they do things like establish performance standards. And the performance standards say essentially that I'm not going to pay you unless you get that person a GED in the next 3 months, or you get them a job in the next 3 months that lasts at least 120 days. I'm running a program. I believe in my program. I have to get my staff paid. I'm going to have to think about who I'm letting in the front door. I need to take people who I really can get a GED in the next 3 months. So let me give you just a straightforward example about that. Let's say I'm operating, I have 2 GED programs, and one program is getting like 70% of the people a GED within the next 3 months, and they're getting paid. The other program is only getting 30% of their students a GED in the next 3 months, and they're not getting paid by that system. But now what if I told you that program 1 only took 10th grade readers, and program 2 only took 5th grade readers? Which program is making the bigger difference? Which one is more important in the course of what it is we're trying to achieve? And it's this difference in outcomes when you subtract away the effect of maturation and history that is what we call the net impact that a program is making. It turns out that random assignment is an elegant and simple and reliable way to solve these 3 problems. So it is where you start when you want to answer the what difference question. There are a lot of misconceptions about random assignment studies. So one of them will be that the program can't be very flexible and everything has to be frozen. And another one is that it has to be very standardized and have a narrow theory, et cetera. But in fact, I can give you lots of examples of programs that have huge variation, are very creative, and that also we were able to figure out a way to do a random assignment study. So that's why people often start with wanting to use random assignment, because it's the most elegant way to solve the selection problem when you're trying to understand how much is due to the program and how much is due to maturation and history. There are alternatives. Regression discontinuities are a design that's encouraging. We've used comparative interrupted time series designs. But the thing to understand is that you can never get to the end using those designs and have the same degree of confidence or certainty in the result that you end up with. And let me end with just one final example. So let's say that Lee writes yet another book, and her book sells 100 copies a month for the next 2 years.
Aww.
And then, all right, let's take it up to 1,000. And then she gets this amazing phone call. It's Oprah Winfrey, and she'd like her to come onto her show. She goes on the show today, and tomorrow, the next week, she's selling 10,000 books a month. I don't need a randomized controlled trial to know that the appearance on the Oprah Winfrey show caused this effect. The causal inference is incredibly strong. It's a perfect example of an interrupted time series design. The problem is the world that we all work in doesn't have sharp demarcations like that, doesn't lead to impacts that are huge like that. You're constantly trying to tease out relatively small differences. So that's essentially why random assignment is often preferred. And I guess the last thing I would say, which I feel very strongly about in this field, these other methods require an enormous amount of statistical manipulation and assumptions. And as Henry Aaron said famously in one of his books, what's a common tribesperson to do, you and me, when the witch doctors disagree?
I want to make 2 points stipulating that it's absolutely true that, as Gordon says, that random assignment is the most elegant way of getting certainty. It's just a question of, can you get certainty about all the things that you want certainty about, and what price do you pay? My 2 points are, one has to do with programs. Proven programs are a fabulous starting point. The question is, should they be treated as a destination? As, for example, when the Social Innovation Fund is funding the replication of proven programs. Is that where you stop, even though it's called an innovation fund? Do you, can you use these proven programs as a takeoff point instead of a destination? And I'm thinking of the most elegantly evaluated early childhood program is the Nurse Family Partnership, which is always cited as the program we can really count on. Sorry. The Nurse Family Partnership started 34 years ago in Elmira, New York. I got to write about it in my first book. It was a wonderful home visiting program. They did a randomized evaluation of the program in Elmira. They did another one in Memphis, and they did a third one in Denver. All three used a different demographic, made it even more reliable. All three had reasonably good outcomes, enough to go to the bank with. They have never served families with drug-abusing parents, with severely depressed moms, or families involved with domestic violence. So I was talking about this at a talk I gave a couple of months ago, and a woman came up to me afterwards, and she said, I come from Rochester. We, with the United Way, with a couple of other nonprofits, decided we wanted to use the Nurse Family Partnership as developed 34 years ago and as manualized, but we decided we wanted to add a capacity to deal with drug-abusing families, a capacity to deal with domestic violence, with severe maternal depression, and she said, you didn't mention this, but we added a housing specialist because we found that was such a big issue for our families. And we were told by the implementers of the Nurse Family Partnership that we could not use that name. We were further told that we might not be eligible for the new home visiting funds because we didn't have a proven program. Now, that's not something that's wrong with randomized trials. It's something wrong with how we use them and how we get so stuck on it's only proven if it had these 3 elegant evaluations so long ago. And I've talked to David Olds about this, and he said, yes, we're testing some of these other things, and we'll have some results in a few years. But he's absolutely sure that the proven program is the limited one. The other place where randomized trials are not useful is when you're talking about complex initiatives. I talked about the Harlem Children's Zone. Think about smoking cessation. Smoking cessation, people were trying to reduce smoking for a very long time. It finally took off when people figured out that you couldn't do any one thing. You had to change norms, you had to change advertising, you had to change what the doctors told people, you had to change the cigarette packages. You had to do all of those things at once to get the results. There was a group at the Institute of Medicine asked to advise on the evidence on obesity prevention. That was 2 years ago. No, 1 year. 2 years ago. They came out with their report last year. Virtually no evidence on anything other than the most trivial and narrow efforts to reduce obesity. But lots of impressions, lots of research showing what might work. And what this group at the IOM said, 2 things. First of all, if you have to act now with virtually no evidence, you have to continuously monitor progress toward results as people are trying things. You have to be able to make mid-course corrections. you have to be able to look to my page. You have to examine the potential for blending the limited evidence that's available with theory and expert opinion and practice-based experience and local wisdom. Now, this report also said, here's how you would go about getting the evidence so that 5 years will be in a better shape. And I would recommend this report to all of you. The National Academy of Sciences has now made all of its reports free, downloadable, and it's oh dear, I'm not going to be able to remember the name, but it's evidence.
The link and we'll put it up on our website.
Evidence about obesity prevention is what you're looking for.
Can you talk a little bit, both of you?
Thank
Oh, thank you. It's so rare that people think my voice is not loud enough. Can you talk a little bit I'm aware of time, so very briefly about what kinds of things the Institute of Medicine report said, or what kinds of things you think are the things you want to look at when you're putting something in place? When you're putting something in place that is this multi-layered sort of saturation model, doing all kinds of things at once, what are some of the kinds of evidence that you want to look at? I know you talked earlier about how you don't just do a randomized control trial of each of the different pieces of it,
Right.
but you look at other things. And if you could both, and again, quickly do that, and then I will turn us towards the last question before closing, and then we'll open it up to the floor.
Well, I think what you have to start with is you have to start with a results framework. Because otherwise, if you need an anchor. And if the anchor is more, as it is for the Harlem Children's Zone, more kids making it from cradle to college graduation, or we would add career preparation, then what you need next is the measures to document that. And that's harder than it ought to be, because we are having a very hard time agreeing on the measures of all the school readiness, the high school graduation, et cetera. And I think we need a lot of expert help on that. But then you map backwards, and you look at, then you get sort of a theory-based evaluation. You look at the activities that are intended to change those results. And you see, are those activities in place? Are they connected to the results? And you do that for subpopulations, but you try to do that on a population-wide basis. And if you get that from 20 different promised neighborhood sites, you can begin to see, are the activities connected to the results by research? And are they connected to the results? Can we count? Is there a magnitude of effect that's like the Oprah effect on my book? I'm gonna work on that. And obviously, if the effect is going to be very, very subtle, then you're in big trouble, because then you're not going to be able to account for the noise in the system. But if you're getting big effects, then from a lot of different places, and you're willing to put together what you're learning from practice every single day and from performance management every single day, and you're getting these 20 sites to be collecting the measurements on an agreed upon series of results, you can begin to make a case beyond a reasonable doubt that this is what is affecting those results. Can't swear to it, can't prove certainty, but you have a lot of really useful information.
So I would just add that you, again, want to think about the stages of development of a program that I described earlier, and think about where you are on this particular issue or problem. You want to make sure that there are opportunities for innovation. And in fact, in the Social Innovation Fund, in the Nurse-Family Partnership, the way OMB has structured it, there is the opportunity to do things that are not proven. There's fewer dollars for it. The state can only spend 25% of the money. You have to agree to do a study. So they have tried to accommodate the idea that there's that they want to also build new knowledge and new things. And I think it's fair to say that Lee's right. We need to do more of that. We need to be sensitive to it and concerned. But ultimately, what you're trying to do is surround this problem with as much good information as you can. That's process information, that's information about the problem, that's longitudinal tracking data, et cetera, so that you begin to try to build a case and get to a point where at some future moment you'd want to do something a little bit more rigorous. But in order to just add some spice to the meeting, let me take on this issue of the components that Lee has so effectively shut down. So let's take the Harlem Children's Zone, right? So there are many, many things going on in the Harlem Children's Zone, but if you start with younger kids, it begins with Baby College, which is, I think, like a 9-week program, early in a child's life with the parents trying to teach them some parenting stuff. And then there's a long hiatus, and then they go to the 3-year-old journey. And that's a Saturday program that lasts for several Saturdays, and it's trying to help parents be sensitive to child's stages of development and what kinds of information they should have, what kinds of things they should be doing with the child to facilitate that. And then it goes to the Get Ready for Pre-K program, which is a more intensive kind of pre-K program that has certain aspects, et cetera. So, there's an argument to be made that while the whole is certainly greater than the sum of the parts have to equal something. And I could design a study of those individual parts that I just described for you.
I don't have a problem with that, Gordon. I should not have dismissed that so lightly. You won't get the beauty of the Harlem Children's Zone, but you will get from there, for example, I think some of their components are a little bit weaker than others. You could learn that by just assessing the component. And I want to be on record as wanting to take back what I said about that.
Don't take it back. It's more fun if we So the other point I wanted to make about this is the other big question for the Harlem Children's Zone or any Promised Neighborhoods program was, the argument is in this, how many square blocks? 20-some square blocks now, or 50 or 100 square blocks. We're serving the community. But what percent of kids really are getting into those programs I just described? 1%, 10%, 50%, 70%? And then what percent of them actually get all of those things that I just described, and then ultimately into the promised school, where there is a good single component evaluation that says the school is effective. So again, I'm agreeing with Lee. There are lots of useful kinds of information. You don't need an impact study to understand that if the Harlem Children's Zone is going to achieve its objectives, it needs to be reaching a pretty good share of the kids. They need to get a pretty good dose of these various components, et cetera. And then you'd also like to think about, well, what if I could design something that would give me a handle on, for that group of kids who got most of it and then got into the promised school, do they look better than kids who didn't get most of it and also got into the promised school? And in fact, Roland Fryer has just completed an evaluation that did exactly that, because it turns out you can get into the promised school if you're outside the catchment area. So he evaluated the promised school and found very positive effects. And then he said, are there differences between the kids who came through the zone and were eligible for and could have been touched by this set of services and the kids from the outside? And he said, I couldn't find a difference. Now, part of it is he doesn't have enough power, and there are a lot of other issues there. But you can be creative, as he was being, and begin to get your arms around this. And that's why I'm trying to make the point that Lee and I are agreeing there are many pieces of these things that you can bring. Some have more certainty than others, and it's the total set of those things that can help you get a handle on this. Can I say one other thing about the Harlem Children's Zone that kind of just drives me crazy? It's really an aside, but so Roland's done this study. The Promise Academy looks fabulous. The results are really impressive and important. And what is it that's so impressive about the finding? There are big increases in test scores. What's the test that he has the impact on? The state test score. The same state test that Bloomberg and Klein are being killed for getting gains on. Just a little thing there that makes you think a little bit.
Okay, I'm looking at the time, and there's no way we're getting through all the rest of the questions I have. I'm sure a lot of them will come out in the questions from the audience. But I want to ask one closing question that I think will allow each of our distinguished panelists to sum up a little bit. You know, some have described this as the golden age of evidence-based policymaking and practice. And I guess I want your thoughts on, is this a good thing? Is it problematic? And as you think about that, please answer it with particular attention to the work of those of us who are really focused on improving the lives of individuals and families who are low income, who are disadvantaged in some way, and talk a little bit about how we, if we should and if we can, how we make the emphasis on evidence better. So that's my attempt to give you a sum up. And I'll let you all decide who wants to go first.
I think we have a golden age in some ways. I think what's golden is that there is much, much more systematic thinking going on about all of these issues than when I came into approximately this field, which was when I came into the poverty program at its very beginning. It was all guesswork, except for the part of the poverty program that was called the Department of Policy Program Evaluation. It was staffed entirely by people who had come from the Pentagon. These were the McNamara whiz kids. They were now applying their cost-benefit work to the social issues. And they didn't understand a lot about the substance of what was being done there, but they really didn't need to because they had the numbers. And the most memorable outcome was when Don Kershaw, the head of the department, gave a presentation and found that of all the things that were being done, you know, VISTA and Job Corps and community action and legal services and health services, the only one that had a very clear cost-benefit ratio was family planning. 17-to-1, he said. And Mr. Shriver invited him to come to his house the next Saturday to make a presentation to Mrs. Shriver. And when he got there, it turned out that Mrs. Shriver was accompanied on either side of her by 2 monsignors in full regalia. And the profile and courage about Sergeant Shriver is that OEO was the first federal department that provided family planning funds that were so earmarked. Other people had, the Children's Bureau had sort of done it under the radar. But I think that shows you the beauty of cost-benefit ratios, if not of random assignment. But the point is, you wouldn't get away with any of that today because we're thinking much, much more rigorously. So systematic thinking, I think, is golden. The fact that we're making connections, forcing people to think about the connections between activities and results, that we're not all operating in this zone of wishful thinking, that's Paul Hill's term, which I love, that we actually are asking about the connections between activities and results. And the other thing that's golden is that we have so much more knowledge than we had before to build on. What's not so golden is the preference in so many places for a little certain knowledge about bits and pieces of social programs over a deeper understanding of a lot of probable knowledge, not just about programs, but also about policies. Because, you know, the policies we really can't do elegant evaluations on. And connected with that, I think what's not so golden is the widespread reluctance among policymakers, among managers, and especially among funders to make decisions that require intelligent human judgment. You know, we really back away from those. We want the numbers to tell us the answer. And the answers we can get from the numbers are terrific, but they don't cover the entire arena of what we need to know.
Can I summarize that last point as they're not the final answer. There's still priorities that have to be set and value judgments that have to be made. Okay. Gordon?
So, I certainly agree with Lee that I really welcome the new attention, and I think it's really important to be clear with everybody how valuable it is for an organization like ours to have an Office of Management and Budget that gets the difference between outcomes and impacts and really seems to care about trying to do things that really work. And they're open to hearing about this stuff, and they're trying to be more evidence-driven. I think that has to be a good thing. We can argue about whether they're overemphasizing one piece of evidence or another. And the thing that is so unique, and I guess you could use the word golden here, is that they've put their money where their mouth is. That is, they've put our money where their mouth is. I mean, just stop and think about it. In I3 alone, they're spending $750 million replicating programs in 3 categories: programs that are scale-up programs like Teach for America and Success for All, programs that are in the validation category, pretty good evidence but not strong enough, let's build better evidence, giving each of those programs $35 million, Diplomas Now and a range of other programs in that category, and then putting a bunch of money into development, where programs that don't have good evidence yet but have a good concept have an opportunity to try to prove that concept. $750 million. And that's only one of these things. There's the Social Innovation Fund. There's the home visiting money, ultimately $1.5 billion, in part because that model, the David Old stuff, has been proven, as Lee says, very narrowly designed, but with some 25% of the money going to do hopefully some of the more innovative things that Lee was just describing. And then there's the money for teen parenting programs as well. It's just unprecedented. And for all of our angst about evidence and whether they're overemphasizing this or that, it's hard to imagine a period in which we've had more money available to advance social programming than we've had in the last 3 years. The second point I want to make is that we are in a race against time that is the most desperate race we have ever been in, I think. And that has to do with what we're going to do about this looming budget deficit debate. And what OMB has essentially said and done is that you have a few years to build the evidence that we think we're going to need to defend you in the budget deficit process that's about to occur. Now, I don't want to be naive and say that advocacy isn't going to be critically important, and thank God for CLASP and other organizations that are going to try to protect a lot of these programs. But I certainly think this was a wonderful opportunity to shore up our evidence base. And ultimately, we are going to get cut. It has nothing to do with the evidence. All that's going to do is help us figure out where the cuts ought to occur. And you can say it's horrible that a program that's proven like David Old's is going to be sustained, and a program that had lesser evidence isn't. But I'm not so unhappy about that. In other words, if something was going to be cut, I guess I'd be willing to have a little less cutting occur on things that we know something about their effectiveness for. Because in the end, we're all in this room because we really want to make a difference. And we can't if we aren't doing things that really, truly are effective.
We're going to open it up to questions.
I thought you were going to dump, like the end of a football game, dump it.
Although some people in the room might like to have something dumped on them. I apologize for the heat, but we have such a good turnout that we have that. Okay, so this is how we're going to work the questions because there are so many of you. I'm going to ask if you, when I call on you, if you would stand and raise, when I call on you, stand, give your name, your organization and state your question, and then I'm going to repeat it so that we make sure we have it in our recording. It'll take a little bit more time, but less time than all of you trying to come up here to the microphone. So, questions?
My name is Farah Jimenez. I'm with the People's Emergency Center in Philadelphia. And one of the things I'm intrigued about is the model building that you talked about, Gordon, particularly because as a practitioner, that is one of the challenges that we've traditionally been using evaluations to look at our programs after we've intuitively built them, rather than identifying what the results are in our approach and our theory of change on the front end of a program. But my question really speaks to the way that government particularly funds the work that we do as social service providers, in that more and more, because they're using their evidence-based practices, they're establishing exactly our program design for us, what our outcomes should be, and therefore putting us in this situation where we can't really introduce innovation. And I'm really curious as to how you see either it trending or how as practitioners we might be able to better challenge that and allow ourselves to be better at developing the model and really to address the outcomes that are desired by funders rather than they bringing us the whole package.
Who in government is doing this? What level of government?
You see it a lot in workforce program.
That's yours.
Okay, I'm gonna try to summarize that question. I'm not gonna do it justice, I'm quite sure. Farah Jimenez from the People's Emergency Center. Sorry. Okay, she's a practitioner and she's talking about putting models and programs in place and having a lot of direction from either funders or government about how that program is going to look, what outcomes are to be achieved and measured, and not feeling like she has a lot of flexibility in that regard, and what kind of reactions do the panelists have? Is that a good, okay. Gordon?
So, I mean, I think Lee and I are in agreement that at the model building stage, you'd like to have as much flexibility as possible. And I don't know the specific example, but to the extent that government agencies are kind of top-down saying, you can try something new, but this is what it ought to look like, that's obviously kind of problematic. Let me give an example that I think is really instructive. We've done this study of the small schools in New York City. It's a very important study, 105 schools, 21,000 students. Essentially what the city did in the Bronx and Brooklyn, the poorest neighborhoods in the city, overwhelmingly 2/3 of the kids were behind, overwhelmingly the kids were poor and children of color, going to very, very large high schools that were failing. So they closed the very large high schools that were failing. I mean, these were schools with less than a 40% graduation rate. They opened a set of new small schools and they instituted a system of choice for everyone. Unlike almost everywhere else in the nation that tried to do this small schools thing, the city of New York said, partly because of the wonderful work of New Visions and some other intermediary organizations that were all about starting new small schools, that it should be a bottoms-up process. So they set a set of criteria and they created a very rigorous competition process. You had to have a rigorous academic curriculum, but they didn't tell you which curriculum to have. You had to have a community sponsor that was more than just a namesake. So the Bronx Zoo is one of those community sponsors, for example, or one of the gardens, or Filman Institute, or the largest law firm in New York is the partner for the Crime and Social Justice School. You also had to design it so that it was a personalized school, and so that it was small, not just in size, but also in function. And there were a couple of other criteria. And the deciders were a partnership of the union, the principals union, the city, and this group, intermediary group. That would be a much better process. It was very bottoms up. You had to have, you had to come forward with a principal and a group of teachers with a concept that was well defined, that really passed muster and competed against all of these, other processes. And our study found what I think are rather remarkable results that are, very large and systemic, and they're not based on a single test score, et cetera. So I think, I'm trying to say that I agree with you. It's very problematic. There are other ways to do this. But interestingly, almost all the other school districts that wanted to do small schools, my sense of it is, for the most part, not every one of them, it was all top-down. The administration decided, well, this school will look like this and this school will look like that. And they lost this opportunity for creativity, and there's huge variation across these schools. I don't. You should.
Yeah, just a
Jump
couple
in.
of things. One is, it was so interesting when the research first came out about small classrooms that there was a lot of experimenting going on with that. And a number of places like California, which passed legislation that the classrooms had to be smaller, actually found their test scores were going down because they had to close a lot of preschools in order to have enough room for the smaller class size for the kindergartners. So and the other one that I love occurred in El Paso, where as a result of a lawsuit, there were 16 elementary schools that were given more money in order to reduce class size, and 14 of the 16, that's all they did. 2 of them went around the country to find out how you could teach differently in a small classroom. They changed their outcomes. And so this notion that you have to be very, very thoughtful about what you're doing with these pieces of information. But I totally agree with Gordon. I would go a little bit further and say that if the funding agency could concentrate primarily on the results they want you to achieve, and even maybe specify how you're supposed to measure them so that you can compare them more easily, and keep their hands off how you get there. Now, if there are some things that are really known, like personalized schools are better than impersonal schools, throw that in, sure. But don't specify the curriculum. Don't specify how you train the teachers. But do hold people accountable for achieving the results.
One thing I forgot to say, for those of you who are in the overflow room, if you have a question, if you will come to the door and slide so that I can see you behind this lovely blue column that we have, I will be happy to call on you as well. Okay. Yes.
I'm Cecilio Morales with the Employment and Training Reporter, and it seems to me that the policy that is being talked about here is not national policy. You're talking about New York City, you're talking about some schools and whatnot, and I'm sitting here in Washington looking at national policy, and I'm not really sure that there is a dialogue between the policymakers nationally and the researchers nationally. And I wonder whether you could address some ways to make that happen, or if you think it did happen, I'm glad to hear. Be glad to hear that before it did.
Okay, Cecilio Morales from the Employment and Training Reporter, and the question, if I got it correctly, is that he's heard a lot of discussion from our panelists about interaction between researchers and policymakers and practitioners at the local or maybe even at the state level, but he hasn't, or he's not aware of that dialogue going on as much at the national level, and he'd like the panelists to respond to that. Did I capture your question well enough?
Are you asking whether when OMB came out with its memo saying that the bulk of funds should go to experimentally proven programs, did they get that from researchers? Is that part of your question?
You can make it part of the question.
Well, I think there is a lot of, well, Gordon can testify to this because he gets calls from people all over the country, and I suspect he gets a lot of calls from Washington. How much of federal policy making is based on research? There has to be a lot that is based on ideology, the experience of specific policymakers, and that with any luck, they can find research to support. But I don't think that's too different from other decision makers. I mean, whether it's in foundations or whether it's states or the local levels. But Gordon knows a lot more about that than I do.
So I think there is a dialogue going on. Now, the question, I think, is whether or not that dialogue is carrying the day in Congress or not. I don't think that's at all clear, but the administration is making an effort, and it's, as I said earlier, it's more of an effort than I've seen previously. So just to take a couple of examples that you're familiar with, you know, it's OMB and the Labor Department is pressuring the Labor Department to finish the WIA evaluation. And they're, you know, basically saying we need to get better evidence about the effectiveness of the WIA system so we can make decisions about what we're going to do next. Youth Build is another really good example. The president really wanted to put another $50 million into Youth Build. He did, but on the condition that it agreed to do a more rigorous evaluation that the Labor Department is now pursuing.
And which the Congress is trying to slash.
Is that true? Yeah. The Youth Build, the David Olds program is, of course, the quintessential example. OMB began in the Bush administration to become enamored of the David Olds results. It was really the mid-level staffers, is my sense, who were basically saying, we want to make, they were looking for a kind of example to set, a test case. And they viewed the evidence here as being reasonably persuasive. And then when the Affordable Care Act came along, that's where they embedded the opportunity to go to some scale. And I think OMB wanted to do what Lee is worried about, which is very narrowly just doing the David Olds model. The Congress, I think, is the one who stepped in as a result of our democratic system and pressure from people who were doing variations, some with nurses, some without, some that targeted broader groups. David's been very narrow in the group of people he's willing to serve. And so some of the money was, in the end, the bill that got passed includes money for programs of a variety of sorts, and they did a national effort to identify programs with good evidence, and then they said, if you try one of these, you can get this much money. If you want to try a new thing, there's this pot of money to do it. So I hope that answers your question. I think there have been, you know, some efforts to try to make these links, and they're new and they are unusual. Whether they'll survive, I guess, what do we have now? We have 3 weeks to go before Armageddon.
And I don't know if it's fair for the moderator to answer the question as well, but I want to say that I think that at the national level, organizations like CLASP and a number of others that I see around the room help facilitate that dialogue between researchers and policymakers. And the home visiting example that you gave is a prime example of that. We created a whole coalition which was made up of the models, but also of many other advocacy organizations, including CLASP. And I think that that translation, if you will, between research and policy was something that was important.
Yeah, thank you for adding that, because that is what happened.
Okay. Yes.
My name is Donna Cooper. I'm with the Center for American Progress, but have been the subject in Gordon's research when I ran welfare to work programs in Philadelphia, designed them based on the wisdom of Elizabeth Shore. So this is a unique opportunity to be here. My question is a little bit less about the abstract notion of sort of how do we evaluate and methods of evaluation to inform practice, and more because the two of you are here to ask you a social policy question. It seems like much of the work that we've been doing over the last 30 to 35 years is individually focused to change a particular behavior, and we may succeed in getting a woman to work or a kid to graduate high school or a pregnancy to deliver healthy. But I feel like we're losing ground, and at least this comes from my experience. I know PEC well in Philly. We're losing ground on getting to the tipping point on the norms, on creating the norms of family formation, personal achievement, collective support. And so you guys are here, and it goes very much back to the early point you made about are we asking the right question. So our research is building on proven practices, but on some level I feel like it's taking us down a narrow path that's missing. How do we answer that challenge? And how would you approach asking those questions?
Okay, it's Donna Cooper from the Center for American Progress. I'm going to try to condense that question into, I see a lot of the work that we have done in the last 30, 35 years very focused on changing individual behavior. And I'm worried that we're losing ground on making a tipping point and changing norms in communities. Fair assumption? Okay.
I couldn't agree more. And one of the reasons I believe this is true is it's easier to get information about the effectiveness of your intervention, whatever it may be, if you're targeting individuals. And a lot of the conversations I've had with community people about programs is, and I say, so what kind of population outcomes are you getting from your program? And they say, oh my God, don't ask us for population outcomes. We are serving 50 people. And we'll give you outcomes for those 50 people. And that's what we're asking for more money from. And maybe we can expand this to get another 50 people. And when you say, but what would you do if you had to impact the entire neighborhood? We know so little about that. We are learning a lot about that. And let me put in a plug for a publication from the Aspen Institute's Roundtable on Community Change, which has recently put out a volume called Voices 3, where they have tried to harvest all the learning about these place-based, community-wide programs. And what have we learned? It's not enough, but we are beginning to learn about that. But as in the smoking example that I cited, it's true of obesity, certainly true of teen pregnancy. And a lot of people think that it may be an important part of child welfare. What are the norms in the community for us to look out for each other's kids, for us to look out for the parents that are who are threatened with eviction? It can't all be the caseworker to do it. But because it's hard to get evidence on that, because it's hard to do, because we don't have quite the institutions, quite the intermediaries. I mean, the Social Innovation Fund was looking for intermediaries that could get the funding distributed in different ways, but we don't quite have it yet to be able to support the kind of interventions that you're talking about, and that are not only, they're community-wide, they include norms, they include an enormous amount of interaction among many different systems. Our funding doesn't flow that way. So I would say it's a terrific issue to flag as you think about where do we go from here? What do we need to work on? That's a big one.
So it's a very provocative question, if you think about it. My first reaction is to ask, somewhat rhetorically, because I'm not sure I know the answer, are programs really the route to normative change or not? So let's take an example. The Bush administration really thought that we needed to change marriage and out-of-wedlock births, and put a lot of effort into trying to create a set of interventions of various sizes that were meant to really reward, encourage, push, support getting unmarried parents to marry when they were having a child. There are a couple of experiments. One of them's just reported. We're doing another one that we'll be reporting on a while later about whether the intervention itself works, but then they also had a whole communities where I guess the Urban Institute or somebody did a study to try to understand whether those community things were making a difference. And it's just, is this the right route, I guess? The campaign for teen pregnancy, to prevention of teen pregnancy, is really argued for the president using a bully pulpit to try to take on these kinds of issues and blasting lots of messages and things. And as Lee was just saying, the public health people, they don't believe in experiments particularly, right? They're all about putting a picture on the cover of the cigarette you're going to buy that is so disgusting that you won't buy it. Or, there's, Mayor Bloomberg is trying to get the Food and Nutrition Service to let him do some stuff around the use of food stamps to buy sugary drinks, etc. The public health people are much more focused on those normative, broad changes. They don't think that it's the behavior of the individuals that's really the issue. It's the normative and the environment in which they live that's the issue. And I mean, it's just a really hard, big question. If you could, if anybody had really great examples about how to change norms, because they're driven by lots of things that don't have anything to do with policy. I like to say in another context that I often feel like we're confronting macroeconomic changes with microeconomic solutions, and you just can't get there from here. But I don't want to be pessimistic about it. I'm just trying to say how provocative this is and that I don't have a good answer.
And education reform is also falling into this rubric, where a lot of more people are interested in the school climate than they are in the specific curriculum. So that's another place where that's very important. Sorry.
Yes.
So kudos to CLASP and the panel for taking on this great topic, and especially for identifying some of the challenges. So I wanted to throw one more out and see if you would be willing to address that. Lisa Klein, Birth Defy Policy Alliance. And that is, even briefly, can you speak to effectiveness and evaluation for program and policy particularly aimed at infants and toddlers and what we do with the babies?
Okay, so this is Lisa Klein from Birth to 5 Alliance, and can we specifically talk about what we do looking at research and data and evaluation and all of that, specifically focused on infants and toddlers?
That's another area where the progress in our knowledge in the last couple of decades has been spectacular. And especially in the brain research, where we're really coming to understand what happens in those first few years among infants and toddlers. There, I think our research has way outpaced our ability to implement the kind of responses that would be warranted. I mentioned the one about kids in family, friend, and neighbor care, the kind of unlicensed daycare where kids are getting no stimulation, and yet it's such a great opportunity. And there are people who've experimented with that and have been able to do something. Early Head Start, of course, is an example where they even do go out to unlicensed daycare facilities to try to beef up what the kids are getting. It's also where we've got some wonderful cost-benefit studies. I think the thing that stands in the way of all that persuasive research being turned into policy has to do with the question of who's responsible for infants and toddlers. And the idea that government should have some role in this is anathema to a large part of our country. And I don't know whether information, especially information from researchers, is going to change that.
And I've heard, Lee knows, we've talked about this before, but this is this disconnect, right, between we have an evidence base, but it isn't translating to our policy in this case.
So
Because there are other issues that really get in the way.
And just so that we pick that up on the audio recording, Lisa was saying we have a lot of evidence, it's just not getting translated
Into policy.
and practice. Right? Yes.
Yeah, I'm Don Mathis with Community Action Partnership, and given the fact, let's talk about the evidence and the policy that derives from that. Let's assume either the balanced budget amendment goes through or a spending cap goes through that takes discretionary spending to 18% of GDP, which goes back to 1964, before food stamps, before Medicare, before all the social programs, before community action, before all this stuff. What role do you see evidence playing in that survival discussion as we try to get down to 18%?
Okay. So Don Mathis from Community Action asking about if we get a balanced budget amendment, if we get a spending cap, what can we do with research and data and evidence in that environment? How will it help us, if at all? that a fair question? Okay.
So, I mean, I think it's a question of what's the problem here. I don't think it has anything to do with evidence per se to go down to that level. We have a budget deficit and we have a revenue deficit. And that's out of the hands of people who do research. It's a political question about what balance are we going to strike as a nation between, government program spending and how much taxes we're going to have. So in other words, evidence can't make much of a difference when you're talking about such a drastic change. I really see it as being more of a political question. I think within that context, the hope that OMB has is that they'll be able, as part of this negotiation, I think, to defend a larger share than 18% because they'll have stronger evidence about what difference these things make. And when you have good evidence, you can say, honestly, it will cost you more not to have this program. When we did our studies of work welfare programs, that was the result. It was unheard of in social programs. It would cost the state of X more not to do this program than to do it, because we could show that there was a direct payoff in welfare savings to the budget. And I think that we had a discussion about this over lunch. They're increasingly desperate, and to the extent that you can show any kind of strong cost-benefit information that those savings are occurring in year 2, 3, 4, or 5, when they're trying to, this negotiation is occurring, then it's going to be scored in a way that basically says this is a saver. So think about the Affordable Care Act argument. The CBO scored it so that some of the things they were doing actually saved money. And some of the changes that are now being proposed, the argument is it will cost you more. Now there's a question about whether anybody believes, or enough people believe that or not. But on the margin, that's where evidence can make a difference. I hope that margin is fairly extensive. But in the size of the cut that you're talking about, I'd rather put my money behind Alan.
Sure.
No, I totally agree. As a matter of fact, our conversation at lunch really was, so if all these cuts happen, maybe none of what we're talking about is very relevant.
And I said we couldn't talk about that in here. No, I'm sorry.
No, but I agree with Gordon that at the margins it can make a difference, and I agree that the more we can document that we know what we're doing when some of these things are funded, and knowing what we're doing has to do with showing results, but it has to do with more than that. It's a really, really difficult time to be talking about how our social policy should be more expansive when we are all feeling this tremendous pressure in the other direction. Doesn't mean you shouldn't be asking your question, though. I'm glad you did.
Okay, I think I'll take one more question because of the temperature in the room, and then people can continue to have dialogue out in the lobby afterwards and have cookies and drinks and so forth. You've had your hand up a long time, so yes, you.
I'm wondering how you
Can you give us your name and organization, please?
Sharing Moses, not representing
Good for you.
How you figure in some of the things that would seem difficult to quantify, like for example, the role of Jeffrey Canada as a dynamic leader of Harlem Children's Zone, and will that translate into like the other Promise neighborhoods? And also, I've been part of several like national demonstrations, and the participants have always been told that they're leaders, they're setting the stage. If they're a success, then other people after them are going to be able to follow the same path, or resources will be available to them, that sort of thing. So how do you figure that in?
Okay, so Joy Moses's question is, how do you try to figure in some of the things that are unquantifiable, like leadership, and what effect that has on how effective something is, and when you're looking at replicating it or scaling it up to a different size?
And there was a second part.
Oh, I'm
which
sorry.
I've forgotten.
I missed the second part. What did I miss, Joy?
Well, for example, I was part of the original
Oh, the demonstration program.
demonstration. And so all the participants thought, you know, if they succeed and save money, money's going to be available for other low-income people following them. They can have a big impact on them.
Okay, so another unquantifiable is if the participants in the program think that their success will mean that somebody who follows behind them in the program is successful for whatever reason, whether they save money or whatever. How will that?
I'm not saying it's unquantifiable. I'm just wondering
Right.
if it is quantifiable.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Better framed. Not it's unquantifiable, but how would you all quantify it? How would you capture it in your evaluations and your research and your evidence gathering?
The charismatic leader part, I think, is really, really important. And it's not just the charismatic leader. There's also a lot of luck in that. I mean, I've often said that if I wanted to replicate the Harlem Children's Zone, I would start with sending a Jeff Canada to Bowdoin College and make sure that all of his roommates became hedge fund managers, because that was a very important part of the success of the Harlem Children's Zone. But not being able to replicate that, I think what we can do is we can learn from these charismatic leaders about what works, a certain amount of proof of concept. We can learn that if you can put together a whole bunch of stuff, as they did in the Harlem Children's Zone, and we can make it easier for the next one. Jeff Canada, maybe 1 in 10 million. The leaders of the promised neighborhoods, should they get funded, will be 1 in 1 million or 1 in 100,000. They won't be ordinary people, but they can build on what Jeff Canada has shown us. So while I think we can't manualize a lot of the most exciting interventions, we can learn from them. We can build on them so that you don't have to be quite so extraordinary in order to be able to lead them. The demonstration program fallacy really permeated foundation funding for so many years that the foundations were saying, we'll fund the demonstration if they can be seen to work, not even proven to work, just seem to work, then public money will come in and other foundations will come in. It happened for about 10 minutes in the poverty program when they picked up a few of those, and when the money was very, very flexible and you could do that. It really hasn't happened as a systematic way of improving programs, improving interventions. And I think because the idea of simply replicating something in the sense of cloning it, which there are a lot of people still today who think that's a terrific way to go. I think the chances that you're going to get a better program if you're able to adapt it, again, knowledgeably, again, using research, using evidence, using experience, are much greater than if you had to actually clone it with fidelity to the original. But the only great boon of demonstrations is that they show it can be done, the proof of concept that Gordon was talking about. And that already is something. I mean, if there is a school in America that is educating poor minority kids from lousy neighborhoods to high standards, that's a very important fact. And now that we know that there are groups of schools that can do it in 100 schools, that's a very important fact. We haven't seen it done in school systems. But the demonstration, even those that are not being systematically built on, I think have great value. We just have to learn how to use them, how to build on them.
So I just have a couple of things to add. You know, this issue, again, of the charismatic leader is central, and it's why it's so important to build a body of evidence in multiple places over time, because, you know, people like Jeff are so unusual, and In the end, these are large numbers problems. We have to be able to deliver these things for thousands and thousands of people, and we're not going to have thousands and thousands of leaders like Jeff to be able to do that. So we've had experiences on both sides of the fence. Think about the CET program. It was run by a guy named Russ Tershi, who was very charismatic. He had brilliant results from his program, and there was an effort to try to take this to other places, and the replication failed. And we never had a really great understanding about why, but it felt like they missed certain key elements of what Russ had been able to do. On the other hand, take a guy like David Olds. David, in his own way, is also a charismatic leader. He's been a visionary, he's been committed, he's been incredibly controlling, which, by the way, is a characteristic of nonprofit leaders who succeed, and which makes independent evaluation such a challenge sometimes. But David has pushed, and he's succeeded. And he has very strong views, as Lee was describing, about what it means to continue and to protect that success over time. And it really is this question of, is it a franchise model that has to stick closely to it, or is it a model that can be adapted? And there are examples on both sides. Take Youth Build, Dorothy Stoneman, incredible leader, very charismatic. And all those programs out there now have done more of the adapting stuff. She has some core stuff. She provides a lot of TA. She wants you to have certain core elements, but she encourages lots of variation, certainly relative to what David Olds is willing to allow. So I think the charismatic leaders they're groundbreakers, they're path breakers. And then the question is this something that really has legs? And turning to the demonstration side, I'm more optimistic about what's come out of some of these demonstrations. First thing, you're building a group of leaders who are stakeholders in this, and they become beacon sites where people can go and see this thing in the real world operating. They become part of a network out there, and you can find examples where some of these ideas that a group of people pioneered in a demonstration did have legs and did continue. I'll give you an example in the fatherhood field. We pioneered by pulling together the 4 or 5 people that were doing creative stuff around fatherhood programs. And we put them into a demonstration called Parents Fair Share. It became the basis for the expansion of most of the entire fatherhood field out there. And those leaders continued to exist. A group of new leaders began to come on board. They visited the old leaders. The movement began to adapt. The programs began to change. All I'm saying is I think there are examples on both sides of here. Some of them are positive and some of them are not as positive.
All right, well, I have a number of thank yous that I need to give. The first one is to all of you. I appreciate your attention. We've been going for 2 hours now, and you have remained engaged, and that says a lot, especially when it's warm and the food is outside. Okay. Second, I want to say thanks to all the CLASP staff. As you can see, there are a lot of chairs in this room, and there aren't normally. Every chair from everyone's office has been brought in here, and I didn't do that myself, so I want to thank all the CLASP staff who helped with that. I want to particularly thank a couple of CLASP staff who I think have gone above and beyond. The first one is Dave Taylor, who's sitting back there behind the monitors. Dave is our IT person, which means he does computers. And yet, I roped him into getting this audio and video equipment, and he's learned how to use it, and that's a great thing. I also want to thank especially Michelle Venson and Angie Parker and Beth Davis Pratt and Tiffany Conway Perrin, who have worked with me to help get all of this together. I want to thank Alan for his leadership in allowing us to have the flexibility to come up with these kinds of topics and really run with them. He is not what you said, Gordon, typical of a successful nonprofit in terms of controlling. I want to thank John Hutchins, who's the communications director at MDRC, because he has done a panel or two at APAM on this topic and has lent his insight to me as we've put this together. And finally, I want to thank our fantastic panelists, Lee Shore and Gordon Berlin, for sharing their knowledge with us.